various European countries, what life is like for them, and then they're also continuing this Quran series on Surah Al-Baqarah, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to Hada tonight. We do apologize that we were not able to connect with our sister May Al-Mahdi in the news segment. We apologize for that, but look forward to the next time, inshallah. We'd like to continue with our news, our social segment. As we promised, we're going to be talking about Syria and the refugees that have been fleeing the country by the millions. We're going to be talking about this with our beloved prophet, emaad.muhanna. Assalamu alaikum, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. All right. So this is a very, very desperate situation, and you know, there's not a lot of positive things to talk about.
Absolutely.
Aside from the individual lives of people. I don't know if you heard, but early this week I talked about some Syrians in Canada that
That's
were
right.
providing relief to Canadians who are facing wildfire situation. But I think our focus is going to be on those in Europe tonight. Can we start talking about, how would you like to start tonight?
Well, let's say that the civil war in Syria is becoming the worst situation in the Arab history when it comes to humanitarian crisis, in terms of the number of refugees, in terms of the number of destruction, and particularly loss of lives. We're talking about over 20,000 people lost their lives in the past 3 years. We're talking about over 500,000 people displaced, and they totally away from any aid that can reach them, whether from the Arab League or from the United Nations. I think the number of refugees exceeded 2.5 million recently all over the place. I think in Egypt, the over 120,000 people living here in Egypt, and the situation is coming worse by the day, because I think more than the civil war in Syria, it is a conflict between the superpowers. It is about who has the final say in the crisis, whether it's Russia or United States. We've seen United States basically claiming that there is humanitarian crisis in Syria starting in July 2012, and that's part of the Arab Spring. Started with Tunisia, followed by Egypt, and then Syria. But I think the Syrian situation became worse by the intervention of Russia, being the sole partner with Bashar al-Assad, and basically refusing completely to let him go or for him to step down. And therefore, it is becoming really a conflict. The Arab League is unable to really put any solution to the crisis. They probably managed to do something in Libya. They managed to do some intervention here in Egypt or in Tunisia. But Syria is becoming really a very difficult situation where nobody can actually interfere, particularly because Russia and China, being the Eastern Bloc of the world, standing right there supporting Bashar al-Assad. I think after the collapse of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Bashar became stronger with the connection between some of the rebels and the Muslim Brotherhood here in Egypt. So it affected him quite a lot in Syria and how they were in the war. I think the worst place is Aleppo, or Halab as it's said in Arabic. Started in July 2012, and I think started there with the rebels exceeding about 7,000 rebels, and basically collecting weapons and stuff like that. United States started to get interfering in there, claiming that Daesh or ISIS is really invading Syria.
Professor, if you don't mind, I'd like to interrupt you to remind us. It's so confusing about who's on the ground and who's doing what. Help us understand who all the actors are. I mean, there are multiple organizations.
That's right. Let's first talk about the Syrian people. The Syrian people are majority Shia. Some of them are Sunnis, and you've got other ethnic groups as well. You know, you've got Christians and you've got Durzis. So there's a number of different groups in there. ISIS, when really conquered Iraq, started to spread all over Iraq, and from there moved to Syria. So there's a lot of support coming from Iran to Bashar al-Assad. There's also support coming from Hezbollah as well in Lebanon, and other groups in the Shia bloc, if you like. And that made it very difficult for the international community to actually interfere, because the support is coming from different places. I think the agreement 5+1, where Iran had the free to go on the issue of nuclear program, has really enabled Iran to have a free ride in the Middle East, and that allowed them to increase their support and fund for Bashar al-Assad. So at this point, you find that the majority of the army are Alawis, or the Shia. Those are the ones that are in power, and the Sunnis are minorities in there. So you've got a problem in terms of the ethnicity, shape of how the army is structured. That made it very difficult. That they had some split in there in government as well, people on a ground level. So most of the ones that fled the scene are the Sunnis.
So the Free Syrian Army, is this the chief anti-Assad force on the ground?
That's right. Those are the rebels. The Free Syrian Army, those are the rebels, and the organized army are basically
Are they
Bashar's.
also a Shia organization?
No, the organized army are Shia. The organized army are majority Shia.
And the Free Syrian Army?
And the Free are majority Sunnis.
I see.
So here you've got that sort of a conflict. That's why it's very difficult to resolve it. So you've got, in terms of the support on a ground level, you've got Bashar is supported by Hezbollah in Lebanon, supported by Iran, supported by the Shias in Yemen. So different parts of the world are supporting Bashar al-Assad. The marginalized or the victimized people on the ground level are supported by other countries, like Turkey, for example, supported by United States. And you've got, in the middle of that, you've got the ISIS basically invading Syria. So you've got a lot of groups also going in there. So the situation on the ground level has been mixed up. You've got the ISIS that trying to basically control Syria.
And they are somehow, at least claiming to be somehow Sunni.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So it is not very clear as who's fighting who in there. The situation in Iraq is very similar, because you've got Sunnis and you've got Shia and you've got Daesh as well. So the situation here, but let's agree first of all that Daesh or ISIS is basically a politically driven group. So they're not really fighting for land based on ethnicity. It's just it's a group that claims to return the Muslim empire. So at this point, the situation is worsening by the day. And in the past 2 or 3 weeks, we've seen the worst time for the Syrians were using the barrel bombs. So these are heavily destructive. So at this point, the world can't really move. The Russians don't want to step down in terms of how they support Bashar al-Assad. We've seen also a few days ago that Erdogan, the Turkish president, announced that he's going in, joining the war to defend the Syrian civilians. So at this point, we've got a major confrontation between Russia and Turkey. Russia supporting the Bashar al-Assad, and we've seen they sending airstrikes, aircraft carriers, aids of different sorts. On the ground level, you've got basically Erdogan supporting people on the ground level. But going back to the topic that you concern about in terms of refugees, I think the difficulty here, as we said in the beginning, you've got over 500,000 Syrians are totally far from the aid. So the Red Cross or even the Arab League aid groups can't even reach them. You've got aid coming from Armenia, aid coming from United States dropped off, on the site or in the field. You've got aid coming from Turkey. You've got aid coming from Lebanon. So aid is coming from everywhere. But you've got a lot of people that are very surrendered and can't really be reached.
Is it the case, I'd like to know, I think it's important to understand why these people are here. I mean, given the state of the country and all of these conflicting parties fighting each other, why did they choose to remain? Did they not have the means? Was it that they're caught between the fire and they were pinned down? And
that's
couldn't
right.
move?
They caught between the fire, because at this point you've got the south where the rebels are mostly there. You've got the aid to Bashar Assad coming from northeast and the east. You've got north of Syria, that's Turkey, most of the people that you find on that particular area, the north, are the refugees. And Bashar keeps on bombing that particular area, so he kills quite a lot of civilians. Syria is not a big country. It's quite small. And Aleppo or Halab is basically the largest in Syria, hosting or accommodating about 2.5 million Syrians in there. I think over 2.5 million also fled the scene. At this point, what is making it difficult for people, for the Syrian people, is that Bashar don't want to step down, the rebels don't want to give up, and the world outside just can't get in. So it is very difficult. And let's agree in the beginning, and as we said in different episodes, I think the economics govern the world, and nobody is going to get involved in this unless there is some sort of economic benefit. And Syria hasn't a lot to offer. If there was Kuwait, for example, as we've seen in 1990, you've had 45 countries stepping in, and everybody wants to help. So the situation in Syria is quite difficult. At this point, Syria is almost destroyed. So you can't really talk much about infrastructure or an organized state. But what we're worried about here are the human.
Is there any economic activity at all? Those supporters to Russia, Iran, etc., are they
very minor economic activities, because there's also the country is surrounded by armies everywhere. You can't get anything. Yeah. You've got on one side, you've got the Daesh taking part of it. You've got the organized army taking part. The rebels are in another part. Hezbollah is blocking one side. On the south, you've got Israel as well. Right. So you've got that southern part of Golan Heights totally blocked by Israel, and the refugees can't get in that side. So you've got the southern part totally blocked. So people have no way to go unless you go north to Turkey or start moving west to Lebanon, and from there flee to Europe. Or fly outside Syria and come to Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Morocco or anyone else.
You just mentioned the infrastructure. Do we have credible information? Is there, how much electricity is there in a place like
there's total damage, and I think there was a major complaint submitted to the Security Council and the Higher Commission for Human Rights, United Nations Higher Commission for Human Rights, basically investigating at this point that Bashar al-Assad is bombing hospitals and roads. So he's blocking even people from getting any access to medication. And this is making it worse. You're talking about sewage, you're talking about water, factories,
so people
food.
Don't have access to water on a regular basis?
No, not at all. You've got a lot of aid coming in because the entire infrastructure is damaged. And this is really the nasty side of this type of war, is that you don't really have a clean fight where we're just fighting a soldier to soldier. You start attacking civilians, you start attacking the infrastructure in terms of roads, in terms of buses, in terms of trains. So you cut out train lines, you cut out electricity lines, water supply, sewage. You're blocking the people, hoping that people will give up. And people are getting used to that, particularly the rebels and the civilians that they've got no way to join the fight. They were just fleeing the country.
But where Assad is himself, he and his family and his supporters, they have...
It's totally secured. The Syrian army was a third in the Middle East, so it's quite a strong organized army. Was the Iraqi was the first, and then the Egyptian, and then the Syrian was the third. And this is not very far from the conspiracy we're talking about, is that a new Middle East. Because at this point, the expectation is that the final solution will be to split Syria into half, to Sunni and Shia. And you've got the Shia part, you extend it to Hezbollah on one side, and you've got the Sunni part, again, surrounded by some other Arab countries. The difficulty here, I think, is that the Arabs have nothing to do at this point. They totally disappeared. and unlike what we've seen in Libya, we had some activities in the Arab League, basically trying to probably finance some sort of activities, hold the peace talks. But at this point, the situation in Syria is totally managed by Russia. And remember when we talked about the American presidency, and we said when it comes to Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, it's going to depend quite a lot on the situation in that particular area and what happens in Egypt. And that situation at this point, United States don't want to get involved in Syria because it is basically the extended national security for Russia. So Russia is not going to stay away from Syria because that's their national security, and they don't want to give the opportunity to the United States to step in. That's number one. Number two, Russia wants to get to the warm water. So they want to get close to the oil fields, and Syria is the only nail that they can have in that particular area.
All right, you just mentioned peace talks. We see, you know, it's like on again, off again. It's difficult to make traction.
Yeah.
Can you give us a summary of where the peace talks stand right now?
Well, in the first, we're talking about 6 years now. In the first 4 years, I think it depended quite a lot on the Arab League. The Arab brothers are trying to solve the situation, trying to convince basically Bashar al-Assad to step down, as it happened here in Egypt or in Tunisia. Don't want to reach a situation that took place or happened in Libya. They don't want to reach that. But Bashar refused totally to step down. The rebels also refused to give up. So it is an ongoing. You've got two sides are very stubborn, insisting on their own point of view. No restructuring of the government or the political system unless Bashar steps down. On the Arab side, you've got basically, and we discussed that before, that Egypt, as one of the powers in the region, still sees that Bashar is better to remain in power, because if Bashar steps down, Syria will be divided. As it's taken place at this point in Libya, and it's taken place in Iraq. On the other side, some of the GCC countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, still believe that Bashar should step down before any peace can be reached. And here you find that conflicting points of view, whether to let Bashar step down, but do you have the mechanism to ensure that after he steps down you can have a unified government to ensure that the country is not divided? This is the difficulty, because if you look at the situation in Libya, that's exactly what happened. Gaddafi was caught, was killed, and then the whole country was divided into tribal areas. And again, this is really the whole difficult situation, but I don't think it is difficult to resolve it. I think the difficulty is what happens next. Because that particular area is quite strategic, particularly to Israel and the national security of Israel, and therefore they're quite keen to understand what is happening to Syria, and quite keen to make what happens to Syria according to their agenda or their plans, because they can't jeopardize what they had in terms of their national security borders on the Golan Heights. They don't want a new government that asks for Golan Heights. So therefore, they've got the reality or the status quo at this point with Bashar al-Assad, that he totally forgot about Golan Heights, and they're happy with that because it oversees the land of Israel. So they worried about probably having an Islamic government that might ask for Golan Heights. So that's the situation that is taking place at this point. It is quite difficult, and I don't think it's going to be resolved very soon until Bashar decides to resolve it. What we worried about is the situation of the refugees.
Right.
This is the situation at this point. You've got basically Europe. When we talk about the economic recession worldwide, Europe is really facing difficulty in terms of accommodating all that number.
Right.
You've seen what is happening in Egypt in terms of economic challenges, and again, it puts a burden on countries to accommodate, 200,000 more in terms of aid, particularly they can't work. And if you talk about Europe, you're also looking at the language barriers. In terms of terrorism, I think, you know, Europeans are very worried about hosting anybody from the Arab world because they don't know who's coming. People have no identity, and they quite worried about that. And Central Europe is totally blocked. They can't get access, so they're probably moving to Eastern Europe or the south of Europe, particularly in Turkey. But how far Turkey can accommodate?
This raises an issue. There's some, I guess we can say, infighting among the European countries, but also Arab countries as well. I remember last year, I think it was Lebanon made a painful decision, in not only Lebanon, but many countries, saying, look, the number of refugees from Syria is now reaching a quarter of our indigenous population. There has to be a limit. And then the European countries are saying, you know, that blaming others for not hosting enough. And
yes, because remember, when it comes to refugee, the World Declaration on Human Rights basically states on a number of countries to take, or almost on all countries, to take some refugees. And that's based on the GDP, the economic growth, the current population. So countries, for example, like Australia, New Zealand, they host, you know, Somalians and other Arabs as refugees. But as you said, it's quite difficult because particularly the situation in Syria just erupted suddenly. And on top of that, they already have a quota assigned to them by United Nations. And on top of that, you've got Syrians coming in. And they quite, you know, tight when it comes to their budget, on their measurements. And it put them in a very difficult situation on how to accommodate these people. And what worries the Europeans as well is the issue of crimes. Unemployment leads to crime, leads to terrorism. These people are desperate to have money, desperate to have food, and it is quite difficult to handle. Eastern Europe are not really rich countries, so the situation for them very hard.
We've seen some Eastern European countries, such as Poland, say that, you know, they're not interested in taking in Muslims. They're trying to be selective. You know, we'll take the Christian refugees, but not the Muslims.
Exactly. So you've got a difficulty as well when it comes to ethnicity or the religious background, but making it very difficult. And the Arabs themselves are, I mean, some of the Arabs probably haven't announced, you know, taking any. If you talk about the western part of the Arab region, Morocco, Tunisia. Well, Tunisia is having its own problems, but Morocco particularly can take some. Algeria, Egypt is taken, probably they're reaching 150,000 at this point, plus Iraqis as well. And I don't know how the situation in the GCC, but it's a lot tighter than what you have in Africa. Some of them are actually fled to Africa. Some of them, if they can get to some relatives of theirs in Canada or Australia or even United States, they go. But generally, the ones that have no money, have no access to flying, becomes very difficult, and people are just walking from one country to another.
Last month in France, there was a makeshift camp that the refugees, not only Syrians, but many, because they're moving from various countries, where the French government came in and shut it down. You know, there were tens of thousands of people there. Can you address the subject? How well are European countries handling, resettling these people?
First of all, if you talk about you know, how to manage refugees in general, you've got your own population and you've studied their own problems and challenges, so you deal with it in terms of policies and strategies. But all of a sudden you've got probably 500,000 or 1 million walking in. You've got no idea where they come from, which languages they speak, what kind of skills they have, what kind of standard of living they require.
And it's not just 1 year or 6 months.
Exactly, they come in to stay.
It's year after year.
Exactly. So it is very difficult. And I think, talking about countries like Australia, they have a camp. And Australia, they won't allow you to actually get out, because they're quite lucky in there because it's an island. So they very, you know, it's very easy to get caught if you go into Australia or in New Zealand. Very easy to get caught on a port or on the beach. And therefore they have people in camps, they feed them and everything, but they don't allow them on the street. So they give them, you know, certain times where they allow people from time to time to, you know, to get into the community. When you talk about Europe, you've got the major problem in Europe is the actual space. Europe is running out of space, particularly Eastern Europe. You've got England, for example, France, Holland, Germany. Those are all small countries. They can't really host this large number. Their lifestyle is totally different. They're not used to begging. They're not used to crimes. They're not used to high unemployment rate. So it disturbs their lifestyle. And as soon as it disturbs their lifestyle, they reject it. So here we totally talking psychologically. So if people even have the ability or the interest to help, they won't help. So they probably, fine, will give you money, but you stay away, because immediately you disturb the system that they're running on. All of a sudden you've got 2 or 3 people by the train station, suddenly you've got 200. So it messes up the system. The Europeans are not good with that. Because they're not used to it. They're used to very slow motion. People are very organized, very highly cultured and educated. And all of a sudden you've got people coming in that are hungry. They are totally displaced. They need something. So it messes up your system. You've got no idea what kind of skills they have, so you can employment. So that's number one. Number two, they start issuing unemployment allowances or refugee allowances for a time, and that basically to keep them away from crimes, keep them away from, you know, any wrongdoing, and for them to do that, basically to protect their own community from these people that are just coming in and they're desperate to do anything for food. And it takes time, but generally it is very difficult. The worst than that are the local citizens themselves when they reject the refugees. And this particular issue very common in England, particularly after the Pakistanis and Indians are in there. You find that the British are rejecting totally any coming refugees from the Arab world.
In fact, you just touched on a very sensitive subject. There are political movements in various European countries.
That's right.
People organizing themselves, trying to get in positions of power to influence government policy,
making,
right? To block Muslims.
That's right.
To block immigrants in general. To prohibit things such as hijab and Islamic symbols, etc.
That's right.
So there's a whole this refugee crisis.
That influx, it creates more problems, because at this point you're just dealing with religion issues or cultural backgrounds, but all of a sudden you've got people that are hungry as well. And they're probably not on the same lifestyle, they're not on the same, you know, etiquette, if you like, so they mess up the system. And you start seeing behaviors that, and I've seen that, you know, Europeans are very concerned about their lifestyle, about, you know, the etiquette and how they respond to things. And we as Arabs, sometimes we just do things, you know, randomly. So they don't like that. And it sends a wrong signal, or you know, creates a wrong impression about the Arabs. And people in situations where they're coming out of Syria, you know, fleeing death, if you like, they basically not concerned about etiquette, so they will violate a lot of rules.
I'd like to ask you to, we're approaching the end of our segment, about 10 minutes or so. Can we go back and look at any types of, I mean, in terms of recommendations, there's lots to say about the ongoing crisis in Syria, but then also things that governments can do, Arab governments that are immediately surrounding Syria, and European governments. What kinds of things would you say are good for all these parties to take?
I think number one, if you remember, and we remind the respected viewers that we talked about the conflicts in the Arab region, the 23 or 24 countries now, are very similar. The situation to resolve them is the only one. Number one, reform the Arab League, have a boss in the region that can all be you know, under that flag. Number one, have a proper council on the Arab League that can basically give instructions for the entire region to follow. Number three is having a unified army where the army can step in, Bashar, you step down, have you know, have people and say peace peace troops, if you like, Arab peace troops. And because of the language and the cultural similarities, things will go well. Because you speak the same language, so you basically, you get the president to step down, you stay in the country until basically they have, you know, a unified government that can start again a new political system.
And as you've been saying, it's long overdue.
Exactly, exactly.
All this kind of reform.
And if you look at the situation in Syria, the Arab League is almost absent. It's not there. And that's a difficulty, and the reason for that is because Russia and the United States, they're just stepping in, they overriding whatever the Arabs are thinking of, and nobody can step in. You've got a lot of economic ties between the Arabs and the Americans and the Russians, and basically can't do anything about it. But remember when we talked about the Syrian situation in about 3 or 4 weeks, right. We said that it's a change of a playground, but it is the same 1990 Cold War. We said that it is the same Cold War that was in the 60s, 70s, 80s, up until it was written off between the two superpowers, Russia and United States. But on that, you know, on the old Cold War, we used to see Georgia on one side against Russia and Ukraine against Russia, and we see Cuba and the Cuban Missile crisis against United States and feeding, you know, the Russians are feeding into it. But at this point, they moving the playground into the Arab world, and that basically tells us that the world is running out of resources. Why are they moving the Cold War
the
playground
of the,
exactly into the Arab world? Because they want to split the Arab world into different groups, and each group can be manipulated by one of the major powers, and it's an old or a second Sykes-Picot, as we say. So you've got Russia at this point putting their hands on Syria and the surrounding countries. So United States, you can see, playing it very cool. But when it comes to Egypt, United States stepped in and Russia backed off. Saudi Arabia, exactly the same. You find always, so when it comes to resources, the two of them are basically playing different roles.
When you're talking about this, it brings to mind Africa during the national independence movements of the 50s and 60s, where there was competition for who was communist and who was
exactly.
who was democratic.
And you left the countries in Africa are totally out of culture. You've got Mozambique, for example, speaks Portuguese, next to Zambia that speaks English. And then you've got Namibia that speaks German, and South Africa that speaks 11 languages, you know, the Afrikaans and English, and you've got the Zulu and Xhosa, and you move north, you get the French territories, Cameroon and the rest of them, and then you move north, you've got Swahili, and you've got the Berber. So you've got different types. So it's what we call a cultural erosion, where people lose their culture. And the reason for that is because they never had a council to keep these people united and maintain their culture.
The resource, you were talking about shifting the front line of the Cold War
exactly, to ensure that the resources are coming to them.
In particular, is it for oil?
Exactly. So oil and natural gas.
Okay.
Because that region is controlling over 75% of natural gas in the world. You've got Qatar, followed by Egypt. That's a natural gas area. And then Israel, Cyprus. So that's the square where the natural gas is. And that's the next, basically, region. If you talk about wind energy and solar energy, that particular area is also one of the highest in the world.
It's a desert for a reason.
Exactly. So you've got that particular region is just endless resources. And we said before that it's over 40% of world natural resources are in that particular area, mining and non-mining resources. So they're not going to leave. And my expectation is that Syrian crisis is going to go beyond Syria, because Russia is coming to stay. And we discussed that when we said, you know, the Arabs sometimes say, you know, well, the Russians will resolve the issue, and because they are our friends. Nobody's our friend. Basically, people play on mutual benefits. So
I want to go back real quickly, almost out of time. I want to go back to Europe real quickly. Last year, the foreign ministers of European Union, they decided to take a heavy hand approach to refugees crossing the Mediterranean.
Yep.
They said that they would, increase naval patrols
Yep.
and target the human trafficking operations and destroy boats and all that kind
But
of
they will
stuff.
do nothing about it, and I'll tell you why. Because in the end, let's say, how much is the population of Palestine? About 7 million. In Gaza, 1.5. In the Western Bank, it's about 1 million. So you're talking about over 4.5 million people left the country. Why hasn't Europe stopped them? Because they want them out. So here it takes us back to how the scenarios are drawn. Scenarios are drawn to draw people out of the countries, because people are the first resource for development. So you take people out.
This is a part of a purposefully depopulating.
It's making use of it. It's making use of it. The war erupted in Syria. So now Europe is an aging society. So they need young people. So get the young people
For labor?
Use them. And that's one of the arguments in England, if you remember, saying, allow some of them because we need laborers. And they were particularly talking about, poor jobs like cleaning and sewage and stuff like that. So you need that kind of labor, so they allow them to do it. So they make use of it. So we always have to read behind, the scene, because it's not always as it seems. If they wanted to stop it, it was easy to be stopped. Definitely. But they don't want to stop it because it's already on our hand, so let's make use of it. So how do they make use of it? At least allow some of them, and fine, if you can get 500,000 young men and, over that 100,000 kids, so what?
And it's very lucrative business. The human traffickers are making hundreds of millions of dollars.
Absolutely. The Gaza, the Gaza basically tunnels, they were making $4 billion annually of trade trafficking between Egypt and Gaza. So it is definitely a lucrative business in terms of, smuggling weapons, smuggling drugs, and human beings.
All right, Professor, I hope, we hope and pray for the best, for the human beings.
It is definitely, it's a developing curve. We as Arabs, we learned. I think the difficulty that we faced during the 30s, 40s of last century, we've been ruled by a number of, powerful but yet corrupted rulers, and they divided the Arab world, as we've seen. We talked about the Arab League and how weak it is. So I think the difficulty and the challenges that we're facing at this point is helping people to wake up and understand the world right.
I really like what you said last week when you were with us. You said that we need more leaders who only fear Allah.
That's right.
And are not
that's all you need.
In it for selfish purposes.
Absolutely. That's all you need. And Arabs are very good when it comes to leadership. When Prophet Muhammad was there, they all followed him. We've got the 4 Caliphate after him followed. So all we need is just a leader that can take our hands and will follow him. And he's coming very soon.
Inshallah. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.
We've reached the end of segment 2 of the program, and we will take a short break and come back with our Quran series on Surah Al-Baqarah, inshallah.